This podcast was produced by OAR FM Dunedin with support from New Zealand On the Air.
In the untouched regions of the forest, the kōkako runs through the treetops feeding on leaves, flowers and fruit. The South Island kōkako, with its distinctive orange wattles at the base of the bill, hasn't been sighted in many years and may be extinct. A situation the blue-wattled bird of the North Island may find itself in unless its habitat is preserved. Its delightful call includes a variety of rich organ and bell-like notes.
Community or chaos? We can construct and nurture community or fall into chaos. Over the next hour, Marvin Hubbard hosts conversations toward creating a fairer, more equal society.
Community or Chaos is made possible with the support of Quakers Aotearoa. You'll find them online at quaker.org.nz.
Good morning, friends. Today we have Aaron Hawkins with us to discuss local body needs in such things as housing and long-term planning. Aaron, first of all,
Kia ora, Marvin.
Welcome to Community or Chaos. And
what a delightful young man you have introducing your show.
And it's the name Community or Chaos, I think, has become more and more meaningful as time has passed, unfortunately. I was hoping that we might need to change the name of the show for something beyond chaos, but we have plenty of chaos.
Indeed.
Well, first of all, why have you decided to stand for City Council after losing the mayoralty in 2022?
Yeah, firstly, I guess I want to acknowledge how unexpected it is that we're even having this conversation. Truly sad and shocking to have lost Jules so soon after the last election, and certainly thinking of Pam and his whānau and friends for whom the current cycle will be particularly challenging, I imagine. I'm as surprised as anyone else that we're in this situation. I genuinely thought that the local government chapter of my life had closed, but it's funny how events change the course of things, and I had a look at how extensive and vast the government's reform program was, and I looked around the council table, which lost a lot in the way of experience at the last elections in 2025, and thought I had something to offer in terms of being able to engage with and challenge where necessary, particularly the government's reform program, as we set out, and trying to set Dunedin on its own path in the longer term.
Mayor Radish is actually, I like the way he accepted defeat as mayor and continued on as council. He seemed to have a lot of humanity, or humility, I should say, both humanity and humility.
Yeah, he handled it far better than I did.
What are the major issues for the immediate and long-term future of Dunedin?
Well, I used to say that the biggest issue that we face, not just of our time, but of all time, was climate change. And I don't think that has altered. If anything, that's even more urgent than it was 3 years or 6 years or 9 years ago, or whenever I was giving those speeches. But I would add to that that not only are we dealing with climate change and the implications of it, but also as a community and as a society, the rise of the far right and what that means for our communities. And in terms of climate change, of course, we need to do what we can in terms of mitigating it and taking our foot off the gas, literally and metaphorically. That's challenging for local government because the thing that it has the most control over that can help be part of the solution is the transport network and rethinking how we move people and goods around the place. And the issue for local government is that roughly half of all of their transport budget is provided by central government through NZTA, and therefore has to be spent on things that are a priority for the government of the day, who sets NZTA's agenda. And we've seen with the current coalition government a very clear and stark shift away from investing in a future-focused and resilient transport network, cutting funding for public transport and active transport projects, and sinking untold billions of dollars into motorway and highway extension projects. Christchurch North, not a whole lot going on at this end of the country. That doesn't mean that there aren't things that local government can do around supporting, the electrification of the vehicle fleet and supporting the electrification of our housing stock. But we also know that to a certain degree, the damage is locked in at this point, and we have to adapt to a less stable climate. We are seeing this every summer. It's challenging for people in Auckland and on the East Coast dealing with the fact that they effectively have a monsoon season now without having done the planning from an infrastructure point of view to be able to handle that. So we do need to look at how we provide the infrastructure to help us be more resilient in the face of extreme weather events. We need to plan where we are going to accommodate people and where people live, and where we build in those sorts of circumstances. But we also need to invest in people and think about people as infrastructure and community as infrastructure, because we know that the better connected your neighbourhood is, the more likely you are to come through the other side when the proverbial hits the fan. And one of the great byproducts of doing that is that also it makes it harder for bad faith actors who are actively trying to tear us apart, and that's essentially what the far right are doing, tilling the soil for fascism by trying to divide us and turn people onto each other and break down community. That's harder for them to do when you know your neighbours and you know what makes them tick, and you have a stronger sense of connection. So, what we need to do is build stronger communities, and that will set us up better for a climate changed world, and hopefully do what we can to resist the rise of the far right that we're seeing around Aotearoa and indeed around the world.
Now, do you think government has a accountability to the common good? And does the common good include not just people, but the earth? And does it particularly include future generations? I had Jonathan Boston on some time ago last year, and he's very concerned that we're not taking account of future generations.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, and
that's an ethical question. Are we failing ethically when we don't? If we elect governments that don't have a commitment to the future?
Yeah, I think it's certainly an ethical problem, and it's a vicious circle in that governments locally and centrally do the things and say the things that mean they're more likely to get elected, and people are more likely to be motivated by things that are in the present than things that are 7 generations hence. But I do think it's also, it's not just an ethical failing, it is indeed a legal one. In local government in particular, you have obligations under the Local Government Act and certainly under resource management and the sustainable use of natural resources to consider not just people who are living here now, but people who are still to come in future generations. And so I think, there's certainly more that needs to be done, and that requires political leadership essentially to be able to acknowledge, and people have very real day-to-day concerns, and it's really hard to think about what we are leaving for people 7 generations from now if your biggest concern is whether you can afford to turn your heater on, or whether you can afford to feed your kids, or whether you can make rent. For as long as people are trying to survive, we can't expect them to be driving the push for longer term planning and longer term focus and decision making. That's something that needs to come from political leadership, I think.
I think they're connected because for the last 30 years or so, we've seen it getting harder and harder for ordinary people to live. We've seen inequality grow. And it seems to me that people who feel they're well represented, the people who feel like they're working together, connected, have a better chance of thinking about the future and thinking about the commitments we have each other, and also holding government to accountability. And I often wonder if, I think it's a fact that the energy companies have done 2 things. They've done what the cigarette companies did with cancer. First, deny it's happening, and then deny that it is anybody's fault, and then saying, "Oh, we're going to come up with a technical solution. Don't worry about it."
Yeah, or the denial of climate change is hard now, so you end up with people saying, "Well, it's a problem, but we're doing as much as we can afford to do about it." Or even, and now I think we're getting into the territory where people are saying, "Oh, it's pointless to even try to do anything about it. We just have to live with it." That seems to be where we're at now, which is pretty scary.
Do you think it'd be good if investors and people with money couldn't influence politics as much as it's? I mean, you listen to somebody like Bryce Edwards. To some extent, even in New Zealand, money influences politics and elections and what governments do.
Yeah, and you only have to look at the pecuniary interests register at Parliament and see the number of members of Parliament who own multiple residential dwellings and investment properties, and they are the same people who are making decisions about whether or not we should make it cheaper for people to afford to access the fundamental human right of housing. And yet those aren't considered conflicts of interest. I remember when I was at the City Council asking that question, should landlords be participating in debates that we were having around the regulation of rental markets or the supply of land and for greater density development. And we were told one of 2 things. Essentially, so many people own rental properties that they don't have an interest greater than the general public, which is usually the test for how you measure these things, or so many of the elected members were landlords that if you took them all out of the debate, you'd struggle to make an argument that you had a solid mandate for any decisions that you're taking. That's how invasive that culture of and people have responded to the settings that have been provided to them. Everything in the last 30, 40 years has told people to not only that you have to own property, but that you should accumulate as much property as possible. They're going to do, that politicians are going to do everything they can to maintain the value of your asset in a way that you can't on the share market. And so, post 87 and so on, people would have found that reasonably attractive. But it's certainly, we are living now with the implications of a commodified housing market to the degree that Bernard Hickey famously describes our economy as a housing market with bits bolted on, and it's hard to disagree with that.
Well, what happens in that kind of situation for people that can't afford housing?
Well, the market isn't going to provide a fundamental human right because there is no, there's no near-term scenario where for the amount of money that people have to live, they are going to be able to satisfy the market's appetite for what buying a house or renting a house would take. And so that is the role of government, in my view, is to step up and fill the gaps where there is a market failure. And that means building public housing, building affordable housing, and instead what we are seeing is a government that is running a mile from building anything, certainly south of Christchurch, but running away from projects, kāinga ora projects up and down the country. And it is fundamentally a responsibility of central government, in my view. But then you end up in a situation where local government has the choice of just accepting that their communities will be ill-served, or standing up and plugging that gap. And there are plenty of examples where, we've had to make those decisions. Do you accept that this is something that government should be doing, but then also they're not? So you support it because your community needs you to be providing those services.
Is it better to build superhighways, motorways, or build houses and trains? I mean, you wonder how many people were influenced by the trucking industry. How many?
Oh, hugely powerful. Yeah, the Road Users Forum.
You don't wonder how many people have vested interests in trucking firms.
Yeah, and the trucking industry is effectively the privatization of the rail network in the 80s, right? So you can sell off utilities and you can sell off banks. You couldn't really sell off the railway network, so they just ripped it up and handed it over to the trucking industry to do that work, particularly when it came to moving freight. Doesn't deal with your passenger movement situation, though.
Even the freight industry, well, part of it realizes now come to the realization you actually need a railway. When the earthquake happened in Kaikoura, they said, fix the railway first so we can get things to the South Island.
Yeah, I don't think we appreciate how vulnerable our networks are in this country. And similarly, I don't know if it was the Kaikoura earthquake, it might have been one of the Christchurch ones, but certainly, supply chains to this end of the country were disrupted for a long time in terms of, fundamental basic food and grocery items, because so many things are warehoused in central locations and then trucked up and down the country. And when you lose that single point of access, I went to a wedding in St Arnaud in the Lakes District up by Nelson, and it was around about that time where the Kaikoura Road was out, and so we had heavy trucks driving in pretty scary roads inland to be able to get to where they needed to go, and that's the situation that you're in if you are if you don't have alternative ways in and out. And so I think, it's easy to. I don't think it's as simple as saying we shouldn't be building motorways and we shouldn't be building large-scale highways to handle road freight, because from a resilience point of view, and there is merit, but I think you need to be able to make the case that is the reason for doing it, as opposed to, shaving off or pretending that you're going to shave off a few minutes travel time by adding another lane or 2 lanes or however many lanes onto an existing road network.
Since you've been in private life, can you tell us about some of the groups you've been involved in, like Inspiring Communities and housing for Dunedin?
Yeah, I never planned on becoming a politician. It sort of just happened by accident, and then very suddenly stopped being a thing that I was doing with my life, and found in the last 3 or so years other things to be able to achieve similar things that we were pushing for within local government, but in the out in the real world, as you might say. So when I left in the end of 2022, I came on board as a co-founder of a small ecotourism business in Pukerua Bay, which is in Porirua, just north of Wellington. building visitor accommodation to support native planting and pest control, land restoration work. And so that's been running fully operational since Labour Weekend 2024. And so that's been a really interesting process in terms of understanding how you can, effectively it's a social enterprise trying to use business for good and achieve wider outcomes, and that's been really interesting. I did some work as a policy analyst for Te Kura Takapini, which is an outfit set up by Te Runanga o Ngaitahu up in Christchurch to support their freshwater claim in the High Court, but they were using it as a vehicle to navigate the then Labour government's water reforms. So I did some work with them on that. More recently, I took up a job as the Director of Inspiring Communities, which is a small national not-for-profit that supports training and capability building for community-led development projects, which is... in terms of Dunedin, it's things like the Valley Project or the South Dunedin Community Network or the Brockville Community Hub, basically place-based organisations that are trying to support their own neighbourhoods to realise their aspirations on their own terms. So, Inspiring Communities works with people at the grassroots to support them in doing that work, but wider than that, trying to work with government, local government agencies, funders, philanthropy, etc., trying to get them to better understand what it means to meaningfully engage with your community and share power with your community. And so that's been really interesting, and it's been really useful to have an understanding of what's happening beyond the Dunedin boundary, which I had some knowledge of. So that's I do that a couple of days a week, and then I was involved by virtue of council as council's representative on the Cozy Homes Trust Board, which had been set up by the late Dave Cull when he was mayor, and Presbyterian Support Otago and the Otago Regional Council and Okaha and others in response to some work that Presbyterian Support had done, identifying that in their estimates there were roughly 18,000 homes in Dunedin that weren't up to scratch in terms of old, cold, drafty houses that were making people sick. What can we do about that collectively to try and fix it and stop people ending up in hospital for avoidable illnesses caused by the housing stock that they are living in? And so I was on that board. And we had done a number of things over the years around education and supporting people, particularly renters, in terms of things that you could do to make your home healthier without your landlord's permission, basically. And more recently, became involved in supporting ECA's Warmer Kiwi Homes program, which is a funding scheme that supports the installation of insulation and clean heating appliances, effectively heat pumps in homes, and they provide up to 70% or up to 80% or up to 90% of the cost of that work. And what we were doing was finding money from other sources, the Dunedin City Council, Central Lakes Trust, Otago Community Trust, and topping up those funds to make it, where possible, free for people to do that and lowering those barriers. And so over time that became a core part of, or the central part of what we were doing as the Cozy Homes Trust. And we sat around and asked ourselves, do we need an entity that's set up specifically to do this and find another volunteer treasurer and file another set of reviewed annual accounts, or could this be passed off to someone else? And twice. I went into a meeting with the expectation that we were going to wind up the organisation, and then in the last minute someone suggested that it wasn't really our decision to make and that we should go and ask our community what they thought, which was a sensible suggestion. And so we did a strategic review exercise with the local community and housing sector, and fundamentally the choice was between winding up the organisation or doing heaps more instead. And Marvin, you will be shocked to learn that the feedback we got from the community was that they wanted us to do heaps more instead. And so the brief became, the brief had always been quite, and the purpose, the charitable purpose, had always been quite tightly defined around improving the quality of existing housing stock. But we know what we need to do is think more at a systems level around, what we are building and how we are building it, and how we are planning communities, and how how residential development can actively contribute to a better health and well-being and stronger communities. And so that's a pretty big brief. And so I stood down from I was chairing the trust by that point, and resigned from the board to apply for a job as the strategic lead for the new entity, which is called the Otago Housing Alliance. And we are a very small backbone organisation. We have 0.9 full-time staff and a volunteer board. But essentially what we're trying to do is work up a collective impact model where we support a much wider network of social service providers and community housing providers and architects and builders and chimney sweeps and public health academics and membership organisations and so on, helping support that wider network achieve better housing outcomes across the region. It is an Otago focus, although I'm based here in Dunedin, and broadly speaking, what we're trying to do is use research and advocacy and innovation to get better housing outcomes, with acknowledging the limitations of our existing resources, and more importantly than that, we made a conscious decision from the outset that our focus was on equitable access to housing, and therefore we would focus the energy and prioritise the energy we had on supporting people at the pointiest end of housing need. And so that's been the focus. We've been stood up for, I think I started about 18 months ago, so still early days, but it's starting to take shape and really provide a voice for housing justice in the discussions that we have about how we provide the fundamental human right of housing to people in our city and across the region.
Friends, I'm talking with Aaron Hawkins about the needs of Dunedin, considering long-term planning and the plans of the central government, which seem to be more and more willing to direct local bodies. And also the housing needs of ordinary people in Dunedin. When we were talking about housing, I couldn't help thinking of the shape of Dunedin. It's like Wellington, lots of up and down. And
topographically challenging. Yeah.
And we're an aging population. Some of you aren't aging as much. We're still an aging population. And that means we should. Are you able to take accountability of access when you deal with housing?
Yeah, that's a big. The topography of Dunedin makes it challenging, particularly when large parts of the flattest areas that we have available to us for various but similar reasons aren't the ideal candidates for higher density development, whether that's the floodplains of the Taieri or thinking longer term about how we provide for housing on the flat. And that's, there's a whole long-term planning project in the South Dunedin Future Program that is looking at how we adapt to our changing environment on the flat and how we provide for not just housing, but recreational opportunities and opportunities to build community in that part of the city. So that's hard. We know for all sorts of reasons. We know we need to build higher density development. It's one of the best things that city planning can offer the transition to a low carbon city is making it easier for people to live near where the services are that they need to access, and so that's in the city centre or in the suburban centres. So we need to be able to build housing that supports that. And traditionally people would say that nobody in Dunedin wants to live in an apartment or a townhouse or a duplex or whatever, but that's certainly changing. And
Might have to do with the quality of the townhouse.
Look, potentially, and certainly one of the issues that we've had is that there have been some really beautiful apartment projects built here. Thinking of in particular a number of examples where they are adaptive reuses of old heritage buildings and bond stores and the like, and the cost of doing that work, beautiful as it is, means that the price point for people living in them or buying them is beyond the reach of a lot of people. So how do we make it easier to build the sorts of houses that we need and make it easier for people to access the services they need, but at a price that people can afford? And that's a very real challenge. But we know that we can't just keep building further and further and further out, and we know that there are people. You talk about an ageing population. It's absolutely true, and there are certainly people that I've spoken to over a number of years who find themselves living in a house that is far beyond their needs as a person or their capacity increasingly to be able to maintain a quarter-acre section and a rambling 19th century weatherboard villa and all of the maintenance requirements that come with that. So, we need, and if you can build alternative options for people to move to, then that has the flow-on effect of freeing up other housing stock for young families or whoever might have the capacity or the interest or the need for larger housing stock. So, it's a continuum. The housing needs, and they are all interrelated. But the short version is that we need to build more of them, and more of them need to be close to the city and suburban centres, and we need to be able to provide access to transport for people to get to and from where they need to get to in order to be able to take up those opportunities.
If the central government's not interested in housing people or building more houses, which seems fairly obvious, that leaves the housing in the lap of the local bodies to some extent.
Yeah, this is sort of what I was getting at before, that the government will say that effectively it's a philosophical difference in that a conservative government doesn't see it necessarily as being the role of the state to be providing these things. And so the minister will say things like, we are looking for local solutions and working with the community sector and supporting community housing providers to be able to provide this service to people who need it. And that sounds fine, whether or not you support that as a philosophical approach. It is very clearly a philosophical, a valid philosophical argument, in the same way that community development is essentially a core conservative value. When you talk about people just getting to know their neighbours and supporting each other better, I grew up in a small rural town. We didn't call it community-led development. We just called it church or the rugby club or whatever. The difference is when you get to a conversation about equity and acknowledging that some neighbourhoods and some communities require more help than others to get to that point, at which point there you get something of a divergence. But we're currently in a situation where, particularly at this end of the country, the government have decided not to build more public housing, but then haven't been particularly enthusiastic to date in supporting or providing the kinds of supports that community housing providers need to be able to make the model work at their end. And so, at some point you have to get to a situation. At some point you have to come to the realization that they're maybe not interested or don't see it as pressing of an issue as we do, and it's made all the more galling when you deal with the end result of these sorts of policies in the long term. As you said earlier, over decades, making the commodification of housing and making it harder and harder for people to access fundamental human rights, and then to be treated by the Prime Minister as bad for business because Chuck and Mary are here on their dream holiday to New Zealand and don't want to have to be reminded of the fact that not everyone here has somewhere to live, and therefore the police should just sweep up all of the homeless people from our city centres and send them somewhere else.
Isn't that criminalising homelessness?
It's criminalising poverty, 100%. And I've had this, it's amazing that people are prepared to defend the indefensible, but it's not apparently, it's not a ban or not a prohibition because no one's making them stay there.
Yeah, it's your personal choice under our economic system to be homeless.
Yeah, that's right. And it's it's not saying that you can't be homeless. You just have to go somewhere else where you don't have access to support or community or those sorts of things. I think it's incredibly callous. I think you could potentially make an argument for the moves that the government are making if you have also done all of the work to provide the kinds of support and provide housing and provide care to people and have somewhere for them to go, but we haven't done that.
Okay, what can the City Council do both within our financial limits? Apparently rates are going to go up by 10%. But that doesn't mean that we don't have more homeless people. It doesn't mean that we don't have more need. I mean, I've seen with more eyes that over the last 15 years, the number of people without homes has grown.
It's incredibly confronting, and it is...
Well, the solution isn't to put them under the rug or in jail or something.
No, I agree. I mean, but also it's important for people to realise that what is visible in terms of, whānau experiencing homelessness in the city is but a small...
It's a symbol. It's like, it's not the substance.
Yeah, but it's a much bigger issue. One of the fastest growing cohorts of homelessness in New Zealand and certainly in Australia is older women. It's hard to get a sense of the scale of need because a lot of people couch surfing, or particularly in Māori and Pasifika families, are just living with family and essentially in overcrowded situations, living intergenerationally in houses that aren't necessarily set up for that, and that's really that's not great, especially in flu season. So it's not all visible, but the visible things are things that we can address, and there are meaningful things that council can do to support that. For example, as many other cities around the country have done, council could resource and provide an outreach service that does support people who are sleeping rough and help them access the services that they need. And they had an opportunity to do that at the end of last year, but it decided to defer that decision. And I understand at the end of March there'll be a report coming back to council as to whether or not they want to proceed with that or fund community group or organisation to provide that service. So that's the sort of thing you can do. You can support things like Orange Sky, which is it was an Australian-based NGO now operating in New Zealand that provides laundry and showering facilities for people to use, and they are looking to establish here in Otapoti in this year, and so that's really positive. But one of the biggest things that they can do is build more housing, or at least use the council assets in a way that make it easier for the community to come up with those sorts of solutions. So, for example, we know there's a bunch of land in various parts of the city that are zoned residential and owned by the DCC and aren't put to any particular purpose and would be fine sites for the building of public housing. It could be Habitat for Humanity doing that. It could be Kāinga Maha doing that. It could be Presbyterian Support doing that on council land. So that is a practical thing that they could do if they don't have the appetite to be doing all of the building themselves, and they certainly don't have the financial headroom to build enough of what we need to solve the problem. So you can do things like that. You can do things like provide rates relief or remittance of development contributions, and that's a whole other boring conversation about financial instruments, but essentially it's a charge levied against developers to pay for the infrastructure to support their development. And so Christchurch, for example, has a policy that says we won't charge development contributions if you're building social housing or papakainga housing. So you can do things like that. And then there are other incentives, and you talked about accessibility. One of the big challenges we have is that the building code is disabling, and so you can build houses that meet the building code, but they are not accessible. They're not built to universal design principles. You can't, as a local authority, as the building controlling authority, you can't require a building to be at a higher spec than the building code, but what you can do is provide incentives for developers so that when new builds are happening, you can sweeten the deal for them and make it so that they might build it to a universal design principles, which means that more people would be able to access them. And that work is currently happening, but it's a team of one at the Dunedin City Council doing this. So there are a lot of things that they can do that go above and beyond building more buildings, but that doesn't mean that they shouldn't also build more buildings.
Yeah, if we might talk about blue sky issues, what if you had a government that was not only willing to build necessary state houses like we had until the 80s, but also put, every time you built a new building or house, to automatically put solar panels on them?
Yeah, we're learning. Do we learn? I don't know if we learn. We're getting another abject lesson this week, and I would like to think it's solved itself by the time that this conversation airs, but I doubt it has, about the fragility of global energy supplies and what it means when countries take unilateral military action, and what that means for a small island nation at the bottom of the world that needs to import diesel to function. And so for all sorts of reasons, it makes sense for us to be looking seriously at distributed energy. And
it's not even the most expensive option. It's one of the cheaper options.
Yeah, look at and there are. You don't have to look.
I mean, not for the individual, but if society decided to do that, if the government did that, it would be a cheaper option than some of the other ways of creating energy.
Yeah. The public good benefit of a distributed solar network is extensive, but the upfront cost of that is still beyond a lot of people, and so you need to look at. So, for example, council once upon a time had a voluntary targeted rate scheme for heating and insulation, where you could say, I want to put this insulation in, and you'd take out a loan and it would just go automatically. You would pay a percentage of that off your rates, and then when you sold the house, or if you sold the house, they would clear that debt as part of that. Now, there's no reason why those sorts of models, and banks do. There are various banks offer those sorts of green loan and low interest loans for that kind of thing. There are certainly international models where feed-in tariffs for solar meant that the return on investment at a household scale was far quicker than it would be here. So, it makes it, again, easier for people to do it and ultimately cheaper on a day-to-day basis. We were doing some work with ECA through the Otago Housing Alliance, who came to us and said, hey, look, we're trying to do a study. We want to do a study on hot water heat pumps and figure out just how more efficient they are for people and how much of a difference it makes both for people's health and for people's wallet. And we need to be able to test it in different climate conditions. Can you find us some places in cold climates that we could test our thinking? And absolutely you can in the hinterland of the Waitaki district. And so, for those, and because they reckon, I don't know, up to a third of your electricity bill might be paying for hot water. And we've seen again last week or the week before how that's about to get even more expensive this winter in terms of both the generation and retail costs. So the more we can do to lighten the demand for energy, and the more that we can fuel that demand through renewable sources like sun and wind, then the more resilient we are going to be, and the better off we will all be physically and financially.
Well, that's one of the interesting points. The more efficient electricity gets, the more you have efficient, so you don't have crisis, the less the shareholders get. The shareholders, the dividends actually benefit by power crisis.
Yeah.
I think it's built into the system.
Yeah, and you see, obviously, egregious international examples, and I don't know if you've read or seen the documentary of Enron, the smartest guys in the room, but, there are plenty of ways that a company can manipulate the energy system in the best interests of its shareholders, and that was always the argument when we were collecting signatures on what ultimately was a fruitless citizens-initiated referendum to maintain public control over our publicly owned energy retailers. It's like, why would you want to surrender the strategic decision-making of the energy industry to the people who own shares as opposed to the public good opportunity that serves the interests of the whole country? And so now, we're largely at the mercy of the market.
The market.
Yeah.
One of the interesting things, I think the government, certainly the National Party, maybe consider themselves conservatives. Yet, traditionally conservative governments want local people, local regions to do their own thing. Traditionally, in theory, conservative government should empower local bodies and local areas. Is that what's happening?
No, but they don't have a monopoly on that either. My former colleague, Campbell Barry, who was the mayor of Lower Hutt, used to say that all governments are localist in opposition and centralist in government, which is to say it's easy for them to say when they are sitting on the opposition benches that we need to do more to empower local communities and to delegate down decision-making and all the rest of it. And then, once they are in government, we see them all. We saw there was a very strong centralising impulse to the last Labour government and Labour-led government, whether that's resource management or the provision of water infrastructure and so on. Like these were not grassroots solutions. They were centrally designed. Now you can argue the merits of whether or not that's the right thing to do, but it's certainly not a devolved decision making. And local government would turn up and say.
The irony is that for a left-wing government, that isn't necessarily going against their principles or traditions.
Yeah, I suppose so. I mean,
but for a conservative government, it is going against their traditions.
Yeah, I mean, it will surprise no one to maybe to learn that I consider myself a left-leaning person, left-wing person, but I'm not a statist. I don't believe that the answer to our society's challenges is the government.
That must be mixed.
Yeah, well, there's certainly a role for government to play in empowering and enabling and resourcing local decision-making and meaningful participation.
Does this mean we have to look at how local bodies are funded?
Yeah, does
the rates really work?
It's inadequate to... So what we're dealing with...
I mean, we're asked to do more and more.
Yeah. So local government is doing a lot of things at once. It is playing catch-up for the decades that it kept rates artificially low, and we've seen the implications for that in terms of our infrastructure. So it's catching up on the work that needed to get done, as well as providing for a growing population. It's dealing with an increasing workload that is presented to it by central government, who says these are things you have to do now. Oh, and by the way, we're not going to give you any money to do that. So it's got that to handle. It's now increasingly in a situation where it has to make decisions as to, as government retreats from what many of us consider its core business, i.e. providing health and housing and those sorts of things. Well, if government's not going to do it, our options are we do it ourselves or it doesn't happen for our community, and you're effectively left at the largesse of the government of the day, no matter which tie they're wearing. That hasn't been particularly good for Dunedin in recent decades, and now on top of that, this the great charge towards austerity that we're seeing from the government, who want to impose legislative controls on the appetite your community might have to invest in its city and look after its people by way of rates capping, which has been an absolute disaster in the United Kingdom and in other places. If it's to be successful at all, it's predicated on higher user charges. So, it'll cost more for your kids to go swimming at the pool. We'll have to jack up the rents on councils'
Is user
housing.
pay really equitable?
No, it's inherently regressive. I mean,
That means that the lower your income, the harder it is to deal with user pay.
Yeah.
And user pay benefits those who have lots of money, because it means they don't pay taxes and they can afford to pay the user pay. And often they're not as committed to using what's offered by the state or the local bodies.
Yeah, it's wildly inequitable. You don't... Yes, because of income differentials. So, yeah, I mean, the cost of going to the swimming pool or the cost of going to drop off rubbish at the landfill, all of that is going to be more expensive if you are on lower incomes. But it goes beyond that, because, ultimately...
if they meter water and they decide to charge for water,
yeah, there are all sorts of, and look, there are models that provide for so there are other districts that provide systems where water is metered, but the household is you are provided X amount by volume as part of your general rates and pay for it on top of that. I mean, it's tricky. There are arguments, particularly in inland areas, and it will happen is happening already in parts of Dunedin, where water conservation is only going to be an increasingly an increasing challenge in a changing climate. But also, we know that austerity. The pernicious thing for me is that the push for austerity usually invokes people on low and fixed incomes as a reason to drive austerity through government services.
They're the ones that suffer from it.
And we also know, yeah, that's right, because they the the implications of that are inequitable because you can't do what the government has said that we should do without serious changes to the services that are provided by local councils to their communities. You just can't. And so that means, your library is open fewer hours a day or fewer days a week, or your local swimming pools, particularly in outlying areas and the outlying townships, may no longer be sustainable. And now, access to the library doesn't matter if you can buy your own books, and access to a public swimming pool doesn't matter if you have your own swimming pool. And so we know that the people who ultimately pay the biggest price for austerity in government are people on lower and fixed incomes.
Well, I think that gives us enough to think about over the next year. So thanks a lot, Aaron, for coming and talking about all these issues.
Thanks for inviting me. Always a pleasure.
This podcast was produced by OAR FM Dunedin with support from New Zealand On the Air.